All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Go ahead and call the meeting to order. We'll start with roll call. We want to go around the room. Eddie?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, Eddie Marquez.
Good morning, Paul Avila and Associates.
Rita Loof, Radtech International.
Levon Daniel, Danco.
Bart, Los Angeles County Sanitation Districts.
Jeff Blake, Metal Finishers Association and Small Business Alliance.
Bill Lamar, Executive Director of the California Small Business Alliance.
Nancy Feldman, Counsel's Office.
Derek Alatorre, South Coast, AQMD.
Ben Roy, AQMD Board Member.
Payon Parkbin, AQMD.
Great. All right, with that, we'll go ahead and go into the approval of minutes. Anyone have any questions on the minutes? Not hearing it, I'll look for a motion.
Motion to approve.
Second.
All right, got a motion in a couple seconds. Anyone opposed? So moved. All right, Derek, review and action item updates or follow-up?
Yes, sir. So there was one action item from our June 8th meeting, and that was to provide an answer to David's question regarding remaining emission reduction credits at a closed facility. So we're going to have engineering permitting answer the question during their offset bank presentation, which will be done in the near future. Okay, and that's it.
All right, with that, we'll go ahead and go into the first discussion item, the update on the multiple air toxics exposure study, MATES 5. Go ahead.
Hi, everyone. I'm Payon Parkbin. I'm a Program Supervisor in Science and Technology Advancement Division here at AQMD. I'm pleased to present Multiple Air Toxics Exposure Study 5 with you and give you some update on the implementation of MATES 5 study. I would like to start by giving an overview of the MATES program. The MATES program originally started back in the 80s, and the main purpose of the study is to evaluate regional air toxics health risks in the South Coast Air Basin. This program is part of the Governing Board Environmental Justice Initiative, and the goal of the study is to estimate the cancer risk from exposure to the air toxics using a cumulative impacts approach. The MATES program has some main elements. One of it is the air monitoring program. So under MATES study, we are doing an intensive air monitoring program in various locations in the South Coast Air Basin. Another element of the MATES program is an update to our emission inventory. This is a very comprehensive effort and for updating the emissions inventory of the air toxics in our basin. Both of these programs will subsequently inform us and help us to have a better estimation of air toxics cancer risk through a modeling effort. So as I mentioned, the first MATES study was conducted back in the 80s, in 1986 to 87. And as you may guess, based on the graphics of the cover, it had a very limited scope compared to the more recent MATES studies. It had a limited measurements campaign. However, it resulted in some very important takeaways. For example, identifying benzene and chrome-6 as two of the main drivers of cancer risk in our basin. MATES 2 was conducted in late 90s, in 1998 to 1999 for a year. It clearly showed some downward trends for some of the air toxics when we were comparing those measurements with the previous MATES. The most important takeaway from the second MATES study was that diesel exhaust was identified as the main risk driver, accounting for over 70% of the cancer risk from air toxics in our basin. MATES 3 was conducted in 2004 to 2006. Usually MATES studies are conducted for a year. During the first year of the MATES 3 study, we had some unusual meteorological conditions that impacted the concentrations. So MATES 3, in fact, continued for an extra year. And we continued to see the progress in reductions in the air toxics for most of the air toxics other than diesel PM. In fact, diesel PM continued to be the main driver of the cancer risk during this study as well. We saw that some of the areas closer to the ports are impacted disproportionately to diesel PM. It also involves some enhancements to our estimation of diesel PM and the quantification methods. This is because diesel PM is not measured directly. It has to be estimated based on measurement of some of the diesel PM tracers and markers. So we did some significant improvements on those estimations during MATES 3 study. Another important finding from the MATES 3 study was that we saw that Chrome-6 measurements in one of the sites in Rubidoux Riverside was elevated compared to the all other sites. These led to some investigative efforts, some very intensive monitoring campaign that traced those elevated levels of Chrome-6 to the cement plant emissions. Those efforts subsequently led to some rule development efforts and enforcement of those rules that eventually brought the Chrome-6 levels closer to the background levels and closer to the levels that we saw typically in other sites in the MATES study. MATES 4 study was conducted in 2012 to 2013. We continued seeing the downward trend of air toxics. In fact, this time the dose reductions were significant. We saw more than 50% decrease in cancer risk from air toxics since MATES 3. We also saw that the diesel emissions were declining by 70% since the previous MATES study. That's a significant reduction. But despite those reductions, the diesel PM remains the main driver of toxic cancer risk, and it accounted for 2/3 of the total cancer risk from air toxics in our basin. MATES 4 also involved a new monitoring element that was new to the MATES program. That was the continuous measurement of ultrafine particles and black carbon measurements in all of the 10 sites. Excuse me. In all of the 10 sites, both of these pollutants are very good tracers and markers for diesel PM. So it gives us a better understanding of how the diesel PM is distributed in our basin and which areas are impacted disproportionately to this pollutant. Another new element of MATES 4 was implementation of 2015 OHIA risk assessment guidelines. OHIA reviews these guidelines periodically and updates those based on the most recent research.
Yes, quick question. On your last bullet on the OEHA risk assessment guidelines, my understanding is that those guidelines were more stringent, so the risk was actually tripled, or in some cases it was 6 times higher than what it was under the old guidelines. Is that the 70% reduction in your other bullet, does that reflect the new, more stringent guidelines?
Well, when we updated these OHIA risk assessment guidelines in order to compare it with the previous MATES study, we did also revisit the MATES 3 study and used the new estimations and new guidelines to recalculate the risk estimates for MATES 3. That's the only way we could compare MATES 4 results with MATES 3 results. Well, if you, in order to look at the progress between different MATES study, it's important that when we revisit and go back to previous MATES study to recalculate those risk estimations based on the new guidelines. And that way we could see that there was actually a more than 50% decrease in the risk estimates.
Because the benefits that we've gained through more compliance, if you will, or shouldn't have been erased, because of the new math or whatever it was, or the new risk assessment. But I guess that's what my question is: Did we lose anything in fact, or is this just a different calculus?
So just to kind of help with the explanation here, so the emissions did decrease, right? So that is an improvement, and that's no different whether you calculated with an old method or a new method. The emissions decreased and the risks decreased, right? So that's should be should be very plain, right? But as far as what happened, what was the biggest difference in the OEHA risk assessment guidelines, as you had mentioned, that they did change the way that the calculations were done, and that the biggest change was to account for the fact that children are more sensitive to the effects of air pollution and air toxics compared to adults. Previously, the guidelines reflected really impacts on adults, and by updating these guidelines, they accounted for impacts on children as well as adults. So that was really the biggest change. It did result in an overall increase in the risks associated with a certain level of diesel emissions or for other air toxics emissions, but that doesn't mean that we didn't make any progress. And actually, as Dr. Peckman had mentioned, if you calculate it using the same method, you'd see a decrease either way. Right.
The other, I didn't know when you were going to take questions, so, but since Rita broke the ice here, on your previous slide where you have previous MATE studies, the detection of chrome-6 emissions, as I remember from Riverside, that was from clinker. That was imported into the basin, so those emissions really didn't, the material was brought in and processed here, but I see now in your subsequent slide where you have greater than 50% decrease as a result of that rulemaking and whatever you did to stop that with Riverside Cement and Cal Portland. Did that increase in chrome-6 emissions, was that reversed, that increase?
So just one point of clarification. For the MATES 4, this 50% decrease in the cancer risk, that was really actually driven by diesel reductions.
That's diesel, okay.
Yeah, okay. Sorry, yeah, it was not a continuation of the previous bullet point, sorry, yeah.
Bill, can you speak into the mic, because it's also being, you got to get closer.
Yeah, because I don't know, from my lay perspective, I would think that the emissions with the cement operations was more an anomalous effect, or rather than one that originated here in the basin. So,
well, this 50% decrease is a basin-wide average. So when you look at the specific locations, it could be less or more than this 50%. So this 50% decrease reflects the basin-wide average. Yes.
Enlighten me. Black carbon, is it factored in? Give me a 1-minute encapsulation. Is it after it's burned that then it's factored into the equations here on your MATES?
Absolutely. So the black carbon we use the black carbon measurements to estimate the total diesel PM. Diesel PM is the toxic and carcinogenic. So we can estimate the cancer risk based on diesel PM, but diesel PM cannot be measured directly. It's a combination of many different pollutants. But in order to estimate how much diesel PM we have, we use those black carbon measurements along with some other measurements to estimate those diesel PM. So the black carbon measurements directly impacts the estimations for the risk.
It's a good segue to my question.
Please.
Is since the predominant carcinogens, diesel PM, do you periodically quantify the carcinogens in the PM to actually take that solid, break it down, and see what those compounds are periodically? Because it may change over time.
Absolutely. So as part of not just MATES study, but as well as our PM speciation program, we continue to look at the PM composition and how it changes, and look at how those changes in the composition of PM would reflect in the cancer risk and other health impacts of the PM.
Is that contained in the MATES report as far as that information?
Yes, all the PM speciation data is also included in the MATES
Thank you.
reports. Please.
Just to make sure I'm understanding correctly, so if you used the new OEHA risk assessment guidelines and got these results, is it accurate to say that if you had used the old methodology, the risk reduction of 50% and 70% would have actually been greater?
No, because in order to make that comparison, we had to use the same methodology to estimate the cancer risk for both the studies. So what we have done is we have used the older guidelines for both of the studies, as well as the new guidelines, again, for MATES 3 and MATES 4 studies. That way we can actually track the progress, because it has to be an apple-to-apple comparison. Use the same risk
Are
estimation
using the old.
methodology.
Okay, all right,
Yes.
thank you.
Please.
This is more of a forward-looking question. Payam, could you envision that with the technology getting better, especially with these big rigs and the diesel business, that really the black carbon, not today obviously, but go down the road 7 to 9 years, is really going to be diminishing? It would seem to me.
Yeah, absolutely. We are actually seeing significant reductions in black carbon measurements. We've been doing these black carbon measurements for about a decade right now. Some other sources of black carbon is also wildfires. So some years when we are more impacted by those wildfires, we see some spikes in black carbon. But we do also do some source apportionment study to apportion that black carbon to whether it's coming from those biogenic sources or coming from vehicular sources. And looking at those, we see a continuous downward trend on black carbon measurements. In fact, based on our AQMP, we know that most of the black carbon, the diesel PM that we see, is from the diesel trucks that are not registered in California, so they're outside of our jurisdiction. So with that, I'm going to move to the next slide. So here you can see the MATES 4 air toxics cancer risk map based on the updated OHIA methodology. It shows the areas that are disproportionately or impacted by the air toxics exposure. That being said, this still represents significant reductions in overall cancer risk in the basin since the previous round of MATES study. So moving on to the current MATES 5 study, the core element of MATES is similar to the previous MATES study. It involves 10 monitoring stations all over the basin, representing different types of sources and different types of environments. Most of the sites are exactly this previous MATES sites whenever they were available, and in cases that those sites were no longer available, we tried our best to find another site in nearby areas in order to have that continuation and to be able to track progress and look at the trends. Similar to the previous MATES study, this also involves continuous ultrafine and black carbon measurements at all of the 10 sites. This will allow us to look at the trends between MATES 3 and MATES 4 and see the progress in the reductions in diesel PM emissions. These monitoring efforts has already begun beginning in January of 2018. And also as part of the MATES 5, we are continuing to update our emission inventory. I'm going to elaborate on that in the next slides. Again, similar to the previous MATES study, this effort also involves a regional modeling and risk characterization. Now, the new element of MATES 5 is the advanced monitoring projects, which takes a very big chunk of our new MATES 5 effort. So I'm going to spend some time to talk about why we think this MATES program is important to us. One of the main reasons is that it allows us to evaluate long-term trends in the air toxics and track progress in reducing regional air toxic exposure in our basin. It also shows that there are certain areas in our basin that are disproportionately impacted by these air toxics, especially some areas near the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach and close to the transportation corridors. And with that information, it can focus the AQMD efforts for toxic risk reduction. For example, by providing some guidance on where we want to focus our future rule development efforts or future monitoring program efforts. MATES 5 also helps us to interpret the monitoring data from other special toxic investigations. Some of the examples I can say are, for example, our monitoring efforts that are currently doing in City of Paramount and City of Compton, I'm sorry. So right now we are measuring Chrome 6 in a very intensive monitoring campaign, and the previous MATES study and the current MATES 5 study can serve as a reference point for us to compare the health impacts in these areas with general air toxic distribution in our basin. Another example that I can say is, for example, our future monitoring efforts on AB 617 in cases that it involves monitoring for air toxics. Another important element of the MATES is providing information that can be used for our environmental justice definition. So MATES results have been used and utilized as one of the factors in our environmental justice definitions, along with some other factors, for example, the criteria pollutants or some socioeconomic factors, for example, poverty. These environmental justice definitions are very important to us. It shows us the environmental justice areas where we can focus our efforts, for example, for allocating incentive funds or more recent effort, for example, for AB 617 community selection and prioritization, where we use this environmental justice definitions. And lastly, it will help us to address public inquiries regarding air toxic impacts. We keep getting these questions from public, general public and different communities about how they're impacted by these air toxics. And the MATES studies serve as the reference point for us to respond to those inquiries.
Hey, Payam, I got a relatively easy question. All these nasty fires that have been happening lately, how does that spike into the final results of the studies? I mean, well, is there a variable there for that, or these dust storms?
Both of them will impact the measurements that we do. With that, I have to also add that they mostly impact the PM2.5 and in this more recent case, like even some of the ozone. So it mostly impacts the criteria pollutants. It is very important when we're estimating the diesel PM to separate the black carbon that we get from the wildfires and from the diesel PM. So there's very intensive data analysis that goes to separate the contribution of these two. All that being said, even the wildfire, the pollutants that coming from wildfire also are toxic. So they definitely impact some of the results that we see. So I'm going to talk about the advanced monitoring program in MATES 5. So the core part of the MATES 5, as I mentioned earlier, are the fixed 10 sites and the updates to the emission inventory and the subsequent estimation for the health risk and the modeling efforts. But the new element of the MATES 5 is the advanced monitoring program. Here at AQMD, we've been evaluating the most advanced monitoring techniques and technologies for measuring air toxics in the past decade or so. So this MATES 5 is a great opportunity for us to utilize all of these technologies and which in most cases complement each other to have a very comprehensive look at the air toxic exposure in our basin. Some of these technologies that we're utilizing in MATES 5 include the flight-based measurements. These are some monitoring equipment that are mounted in an aircraft, and the airplane can do some flybys, basically doing some survey of a very large area to look at some emissions and to focus our efforts to those areas. Another element is the mobile laboratories. These are some equipment that are installed in a vehicle that can do drive-bys around some major sources of emission around refineries or some industrial facilities or oil production plants, just to look at how they impact the communities in vicinity of these facilities. Another technology that we're trying to implement is the optical tent. This technology is using the remote sensing equipment and monitors.
You showed the next slides. You see some of these pictures.
Oh yeah, I'll go through. The optical tent is intended to be installed on the refineries to measure leaks. I'm going to go through the details of all of these in the subsequent slides. And the last one is the low-cost sensors that we're going to deploy in the communities, and they're very helpful in the community engagement as well as community education. So here you can see an image of the flight-based air toxic measurements. As I mentioned, these monitoring equipment are mounted in the airplanes. They do surveys of a very large areas, and they can detect leaks and detect some major sources of emissions, and that would focus our, for example, monitoring efforts to that specific area. We are contracted. The contract we have with Aerospace Corporation is for several flybys. One of the caveats of this type of surveys is that this is basically just a snapshot of the moment that the airplane is flying over these sources of emissions. So, for example, if at that moment we don't have those type of leaks or emissions, they may be undetected. But as part of this contract, we're also getting some information from their previous flybys that they've been doing in the past few years. So that basically would allow us to look at several of these snapshots and allow us to detect and identify some of the sources. The other technology that we're using is the mobile laboratory. This is a contract we have with a company called FluxSense. They already conducted 3 pilot studies, very successful pilot studies, where we looked at the emissions from refineries, from oil wells, and some other industrial facilities in these heavily industrial areas. So what they do is like they drive around a targeted area or in the communities, and they continuously look at the concentration of some of the air toxics along with some wind data, and all of these information together will allow them to identify the sources of those emissions. What you're actually seeing here is, for example, one of the images from one of those pilot studies where they were driving around a refinery. They actually detected a plume of some of the BTEX compounds that was actually traced back to a leak within that refinery. It is also a very powerful tool for surveying communities because it can drive all along that community and detect possible hotspots in those areas. So here you can see a very simplified image of the optical tent idea. This is a remote sensing monitor that can be installed in a vantage point, for example, in a refinery. And then it sends a light beam to some reflectors. And as that light beam is received back by that monitor, it can measure the concentration of the pollutants along the path of that, along that light path. This way, we can cover a wide area in a refinery using a much lower number of those type of monitors and covering basically the entire area over the refinery. It's a very powerful tool to detect leaks. Another important aspect of this is 24/7 continuous measurement and provides real-time data that can be disseminated to the communities. And also it can quantify long-term emissions and help us update those emission inventories.
See, me personally, I think that's a great idea. I really mean that, especially for the refineries. Now, the secondary question I would ask you was, let's say a year goes down the road and all that information is compiled, but it's got to be reams of it from that technology. Now, you take it out to the communities out there in South Bay that, you know, the citizens are rebelling against the smell and all that. Will the citizens be able to understand all that data as far as disseminating it and presenting it to look, well, there's no leaks in the refineries no more, so now what? You see what I'm saying? Because before, okay, great, the technology wasn't there. You had smells, there's a leak, I can smell gas, all these different types of complaints. But now with that technology, and let's use the scenario that the refinery actually did fix the leaks. So now there's no leakage whatsoever. So now that information is presented to the community and they don't believe it. Now what?
So I have to say to that, other than major leaks, potential major leaks in a refinery that can be easily detected with this type of technology and be fixed very quickly, in the end, there's so many different equipment, so many different flanges, valves, and pipings in a huge facility that all of them have probably like a very small amount of leak. So cumulatively, and when you look at the entire refinery as an area source, there are still, like, even if you fix all of the major leaks, there is still some, as an area source, you will see some of those emissions. And this technology allows us to assess the impact of that entire emission as an area source for a refinery and whether that's impacting the communities. So even when the leaks are fixed, this is a very important and useful technology to have.
I have a question on the earlier one, earlier slide, the mobile air toxic lab. Uh, I'm sure you do, but do you have a schedule for these, what you referred to as drive-bys? In other words, is it done in the morning? Is it done in evening rush hour traffic? Is it done on weekends, or is it a set schedule?
I think we try to mix it up in order to get the impact in different times of the day, weekend, weekday comparison, so we can correlate that with the operation of those industries. But I think. Yeah, but one of the limitations of the flux sense is that it has to be conducted during the daytime. It requires sunlight for some of those measurements. So in this case, this is the daytime only.
Which of this technology is able to identify the contaminants? As an example, the tent version, is that only identifying an area based on like opacity results, or is it actually identifying what the leak?
Actually, the optical tent, this specific technology is measuring the BTEX compounds. The BTEX compounds, when it comes to the refinery emissions, are very good tracers for any type of emissions that coming from refineries. That's why it's a very good indicators for major leaks. But some of the other technologies can measure other air toxics, and that's why these are complementing each other. And there's no one perfect technology to be able to measure all the air toxics for all sorts of sources. That's why we're utilizing all sorts of different technologies that we have.
Do the mobile labs just collect samples that you analyze back
No,
elsewhere, or is it doing it real time?
No, the mobile laboratory also uses some of the optical monitors, so it is also continuously measuring those pollutants, but it requires some data analysis. So like it's not really real time, so it requires us to come back and analyze those data and interpret that data and generate a report.
So you're not going to like drive around LA and then come back and say analyze a sample and be able to identify where that came from. If you've done 100 miles, you need to limit it to a small area that you know, maybe a block or something.
Probably more than a block. We usually target an area if it's a community to drive by in the streets, or target like a specific facility like a refinery, and then they drive around the refinery to take like several surveys. And that's why it takes some level of data analysis to interpret the data.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And lastly, I want to talk about the sensor networks and the community engagement, also as part of the advanced monitoring portion of the MATES 5. We are implementing two separate sensor deployment efforts. One of them is focused on measuring PM 2.5, utilizing the purple air sensors. As well as measuring black carbon using some black carbon sensors and some lower cost black carbon monitors. We have already identified two communities for these sensor deployments, one in Mira Loma area and another in West Long Beach. Both of these communities are heavily impacted by the diesel emissions, and that's why our efforts for measuring PM and black carbon has been focused on these two areas to see like how they're impacted by the diesel PM. Another sensor deployment effort as part of the MATES 5 is in collaboration with a company named QSense or Aclima. So they're developing a VOC sensor. It's a newer technology when it comes to the sensors, local sensors, and because it's measuring VOC, we are focusing these deployments in communities that are impacted by the refinery emissions, for example, in city of Wilmington and Carson and West Long Beach.
Quick question. On the community engagement part of the process, I mean, some of these technologies are quote unquote emerging technologies, not like those that are well established at the district. And I know in the past, the refineries specifically have expressed concern over some of these technologies. So what kind of process is the district going to follow in order to develop guidelines or inform the community as to which technology will be used, which technology the district is going to endorse, and allow the opportunity for comment on pros and cons?
That's a great question. Actually, the first sensor deployment effort that I mentioned that utilizes purple air and black carbon sensors, these are both commercially available, have been widely used. So we're asking for community partnership and engage them with those deployments. But when it comes to the VOC sensors, these are newer technologies. They're not commercially available right now, and that's why we have this partnership with QSense and Aclima. And also, we're trying to do these deployments near some other areas where we have deployed other advanced monitoring techniques that are serve as a reference point. For example, if we get a partnership to install the optical tent at one of those refineries, ideally we want to have those VOC sensor deployments in the communities impacted by the emissions from that refinery, and that would help us interpret the data that we get from those VOC sensors in comparison with the more advanced measurements that we're doing. Do you want to add something?
Yeah, so everything that Payam said is true, and I just wanted to kind of put it in context of kind of larger scope of your question with regards to the sensors and making decisions and the education portion of that. So you may be aware that we have the AQ-SPEC program in our division and by AQMD that has been doing the sensor evaluation for all the different types of low-cost sensors to be able to provide to the public kind of the technical evaluation of those sensors. In addition, through the U.S. EPA STAR grant, that group is working with the communities, and the product of that will be a educational toolbox, which will be applied and be provided on our website and provided in some of our outreach, so that there's an education, not just the training, but also the education as far as some of the, satisfying some of the expectations or setting some of the expectations for these other emerging technologies type of measurements. So I think the combination of that will help provide informative and contextual information to the measurements that they're seeing.
Thank you. So just to follow up on that, do you envision this being like an internal staff process that's happening, or is the board going to be engaged at some point? Is there going to be a report presented to the board as far as, okay, we endorse technology number one, but not technology number two? Because I imagine there's going to be competing technologies. So how is the district going to weigh the pros and cons and decide what is the appropriate monitoring technology?
Sure, this is Jason. So as mentioned in maybe the presentation a couple months ago that I had given, there's a lot of development that's been going on as far as some of the advanced and low-cost technologies along with some of our other measurement technologies. And all of these are, and MATES 5 is kind of a technology demonstration, if you would, of a lot of these toolboxes that are emerging, because eventually a lot of them are going to merge as part of MATES 5, but as we move forward into some of our other monitoring programs, as Dr. Papin had alluded to, AB 17, Rule 1180. So we're trying to assess a lot of these things through MATES 5 to see what portions of it will be most appropriate for some of those programs. So we are, as part of the AB 17 process, working with the state to kind of perform some sort of evaluation, not necessarily, what's maybe appropriate for what, but maybe to give some guidelines of certain types of sensors that may be useful for certain types of applications and have a communication message around that, if that answers the question.
I have a couple. I actually have two questions. I've heard that for the low-cost sensors, less expensive sensors, that they're more accurate reading particulate than VOCs. Is that true? And if so, how would you rate their accuracy?
Yeah, so the AQSpec program has run a number of tests with regards to PM sensors and others as well for criteria pollutants and others. And it does show that on the technical specification side, that the PM sensors as a category are definitely more corresponding to what we would consider reference methods. The VOC portion of that, there is a challenge because with the VOC, you're talking about a lot of different gases that respond to different types of measurement techniques. So there hasn't been at this point a sensor that we'd be confident to say that you're measuring within, 50% at this point. It doesn't mean that those technologies aren't emerging. I think we've been trying to advocate to say that there's a real need to have a good low-cost VOC sensor, because I think those along with PM are I think more in line with what the community are interested in measuring and having more data on.
Okay. And then my other question is for these handheld or portable sensors, has the district established a protocol or guidelines for the people who will be using those? In other words, I see this as maybe analogous to the radar gun out on Golden Springs Drive that the cop may have, or the breathalyzer that they use to stop somebody. When was it calibrated? How has it been kept? When was it last maintained? And so on. Is that going to pose an issue here if this is used for enforcement purposes other than just monitoring?
So, I mean, at this point, in the evaluation of a lot of the technologies, I think we're using them as tools to kind of perform survey level measurements to give us more information. And if that information leads to say that there needs to be more robust methods to be applied to an area, then we would use those methods to go in there for compliance reasons. Again, it doesn't mean that technology can't move forward in leaps and bounds and get the proper certifications, but there's only a couple of sensors that have met kind of those standards, namely for ozone. So when we look kind of farther ahead about the community expectation, again, I look towards that community toolbox that's being developed by the AQSpec program. Also, there exists a toolkit that's being developed by US EPA. So, I think all of the air regulation agencies that are involved with sensors and involved with air monitoring, we are all messaging to try to indicate the limitations and the potential that sensors have.
So right now you're just really using it for detection purposes.
Yes, that's right.
Not to getting too much into the weeds, but sort of mimicking what, we're way into the weeds now. To mimic what Bill was saying as far as what this data is for, the way I'm taking it, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you're having these advanced methods that are more of a screening tool. They're qualitative measurements that then you come out and use some other instrument to validate that as a quantitative method as a second step. Is that correct?
Yes, that's our current strategy.
You could hear from people in the community. When you start getting more data, the question is, what do you do with it? So I think it's very helpful to qualify it as far as this is just a way as a Geiger counter to say, hey, there's something to look at, and then we go back when the standard method is a second step.
Exactly, and that's part of the communication tool.
Further to beat the dead horse, will this data be available to the general public in any way? The reason I ask is because industry, some of our industries are seeing a lot of lawsuits with stormwater issues because there is public data published. Even though a company may be in total compliance, there's data published that make things look a little bit questionable, and a lot of unscrupulous attorneys jumping onto that and creating a lot of problems.
So in general, as a public agency and as far as the measurements portion, we do plan on making data available for the public. We're working vigorously to try to figure out what the best way to present a lot of the different types of data sets, and it affects the community as a whole. In fact, there's a couple of us who are up in San Francisco to try to kind of figure out with kind of larger kind of data integration, data visualization companies, how they would have the capability to do that. So we're trying to figure out, because again, these have been separate type of measurement projects that we're used to handling data independently. But I think when we start integrating a lot of these measurements, kind of figure out what the best way to present the data to the public, and also give it the context. Again, to the point of our strategy to say, well, this is sensor data, this has a certain uncertainty along with it. Here's guidance methods, so this has much better certainty for certain actions. So, and then there's these advanced methods which require a lot of processing, a lot of understanding of advanced concepts, and how we can present those data sets to the public. So I think it's our intent to try to present the different types of data sets. The question is how, and we are working on that.
Thank you for taking that into consideration. I suppose if it's presented as a community problem rather than identifying individual companies, maybe it is not quite so ripe for lawsuits. So thank you.
So before moving from this slide, I'm going to talk just a little bit about our community engagement. So along with those sensor deployments, we are also doing this community engagement that involves the air quality and sensor training. It also involves a needs assessment specific to those communities, very similar to our what we had done in the Clean Communities plans. And all this information will allow us to develop air quality improvement projects in these communities. So here in this slide, I want to show you how all of these different types of technologies will complement each other. For example, in this case, imagining like we're going to evaluate the impacts of the refinery emissions on the communities. Here you can see a refinery where we have an optical tent installed, and there is like an air monitoring station also in one of those communities. So if you see, for example, a spike in concentration in the optical tent, we want to see how that would impact the exposure in the communities. So the air monitoring station would serve as an estimation for the exposure of the community. Moreover, as part of our Rule 1180, the refinery fence line monitoring rule, all the major refineries in South Coast have to implement a fence line monitoring all along the perimeter of their facilities by January 1st, 2020. This is a kind of similar technology to the optical tent. It's limited to the fence line of the refinery. So these two will complement each other. In addition, we're going to have the mobile monitoring surveys with FluxSense. So as I mentioned earlier, this mobile laboratory can do drive-bys, not just around the refineries and other major sources of emission, but also through the communities to look at the gradients and to identify hotspots in those communities. Because most of these refineries are located in very industrial areas, so they are not the only sources of emissions. So it's very important to have a complete understanding of how these different sources are impacting the community exposure to air toxics. Next element are the flight measurements. These are not focused on refineries. As I mentioned earlier, they cover a very huge area. They're better to identify some some leaks or some plumes of emissions in areas that are not covered by our air monitoring stations, or some areas that we were not aware of. And then later on, we can focus our ground level monitoring efforts or some other rule development efforts on that specific area based on these flight measurements. The next element is the community monitoring and the sensor networks. These are the sensor deployments are going to be all over the communities to get a better sense of how the air toxics and other pollutants are distributed in those communities. It's also an excellent tool to get those community members, get them more engaged, and to use this as an educational tool. So some of these studies, as Jason mentioned, requires very comprehensive data analysis, and but there are some of these technologies that actually provide continuous real-time data, which is very important to find leaks, to inform the community members if there's a problem. For example, the optical tents, fence line monitoring, and the sensor networks all provide real-time and continuous data that can be disseminated to the community members in near real time. So in addition to those monitoring programs, we are also doing some major enhancements to our emissions inventory and modeling. For example, traditionally, MATES program was focused on regional scale risk estimates, but what we're doing in MATES 5, we are incorporating local scale estimates for more detailed estimation of risk in the community level. This is done by utilizing, for example, additional data from improved data sources. For example, the permit information from the smaller facilities that were not considered in the emission in developing the emission inventory in the previous MATES studies. Also incorporating real-time traffic sensor data and integrating ship emissions and aircraft emissions into our emission inventory. We are also continue to refine and improve our modeling efforts for more detailed air toxic models and better estimation of the air toxic cancer risk in our basin. So I'm going to give an update on where we are at with all of these various different monitoring programs and what are the next steps are. So in terms of the core element of the MATES 5 study, please.
Payam, I got a question for you. Now, the pecking order of this, okay, as far as what's the latest and the greatest as far as technology goes, would be the tent, and then let's work all the way down to the individual monitors. Is that more or less correct?
Yeah.
I mean, as far as the pecking order goes.
I guess I'll go ahead and Dr. Papin did mention earlier in terms of, there's a suite of tools because there's no real perfect tool.
Sure.
Yes, optical 10 is cool, fancy, and advanced.
Sure.
It gives us continuous coverage, but it is limited to BTEX only. There are other methods that may not be as continuous, such as the canister samples.
Sure.
The canister samples we can analyze for hundreds of air toxic compounds at accuracy that is well known, and I think there's always different parameters when you're looking at real time. When you're looking at accuracy, when you're looking at reliability, when you're looking at cost, maintenance, power, security. I mean, there's a whole host of different logistical as well as technical factors that make advantages for certain methods better than others.
See why I ask that is the lower level technology, especially the little, the little handhelds, I have very little faith in those, very little. And one of the industries that I was just in last week went through that ordeal, the Sriracha guy over in Irwindale, and everything, thank goodness it was a happy ending, but it was just bad information. So that's why I asked that as far as the relevancy of all the different technology versus the industry? And I know that's kind of an amorphous question that it's too difficult to say yes or no to, but I would like to believe as the technology refines further down the road, there will be a pecking order with accuracy, and you can see it now. It just hasn't got there yet, but it will as far as leaks go. But the lower end stuff, you know, either has to be phased out or upgraded, one of the two, in my opinion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So to give an update on where we are at with the MATES 5 monitoring, the core element of the MATES 5, which was the fixed site monitoring at 10 sites, that has already begun starting from the January 2018, and it's going to go for a full year. In terms of the advanced monitoring, some of these are in the for example, our contract with AEROSPACE is still being in progress, and FluxSense started their first measurements on 4th of July, so they just begun the measurements. For the UCLA collaboration with UCLA for implementing the optical tent, we are still seeking partnership with refineries. We might have like a participant who's going to install that as part of the Rule 1180 to complement the fence line monitoring for Rule 1180. And for the sensor deployments, we're a little bit ahead. So we already have approached many community organizers and some community members and seek some partnership for these deployments. So for QSense, the VOC sensor deployments, these are going to be focused in communities impacted by refinery emissions in city of Carson, Wilmington, and parts of West Long Beach. And for the PM sensors and black carbon measurements, we've already engaged in communities in Mira Loma and West Long Beach. And with that, I would like to end the presentation and we take questions.
I think Rita had hers up first. Go ahead, Rita.
Thank you. Payam, on these, maybe except for the refineries, because since you have Rule 1180, I don't think they're going to have much of a choice. You had mentioned seeking community partners. Are you looking for volunteers from industry to implement these sensors, or are you just looking at the, environmental groups? And the second part of my question is, do you envision any other rules like 1180 for non-refinery sources?
Should I take that? So for the community, our engagement with community organizers is basically to be able to reach out to the community members and the general public to seek some volunteers, as you mentioned, to install some of these sensors in their homes and have like a good distribution in those communities. But other than that, we're also seeking some partnership and reaching out to some of the public schools in, for example, City of Wilmington and Carson that would like us to install these sensors on the school buildings. This not only gives us a very good location and access to power and someone to babysit those sensors and just look and see if they're working, but also it's like a very powerful tool to educate the community members about the general problem with the air quality in their area. And your second question was, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, so the second question was like, regarding anticipating kind of things on the rule calendar. I mean, I'm sure you're quite familiar with our rule calendar. It's quite packed right now. I mean, that's probably our best answer is just, that is the best prediction of what's coming up rule wise.
A subject that just was mentioned as far as education, I think that's a really big issue that should be considered, especially in the next MATES report, especially with 617. You're getting a lot more community involvement, a lot more people are looking at the data and looking to you for answers. And one thing I find is risk communication is rather challenging. especially we're looking at our neck of the woods of air quality. And when you say your risk is 1 in a million, most people just, it goes over their head and they just say there's a cancer risk. The people want to know that they're safe, their family is safe. What can they do to minimize the risk? And one thing I've never seen from almost any agency is to say, what is your cancer risk and what can you do to minimize your cancer risk? We talk about air quality, but when you talk about a MATE study, to me, I think it'd be nice to have an introduction saying, here is cancer risk of what you could be exposed to that influences your risk. We're here to talk about the air quality. That's something you can't control, and that's why we're here. Here are things that you can control, and just start off the context of that. Because otherwise, we just talk about the sky's falling, you can't do anything about it, or something that people get concerned about. It'd be nice to give them the power of, here's things that are in your control that are very significant.
Absolutely. So that's a great comment, and honestly, something that we deal with at virtually every public meeting, and every time people call us and have questions about their air quality, they looked at the MATES map, maybe they had some additional questions. So this is definitely a really big piece of our job here is just risk communication. So that's a great suggestion.
Bill?
Yeah, in one of your earlier slides on community engagement, I noticed you have a bullet point there on needs assessment. How do you plan, or how have you planned on conducting a needs assessment? What is it going to be driven anecdotally, or is it going to be driven by data?
I know, Bill, you were involved with the Clean Communities Plan, and what I was calling needs assessment, or we can call it community assessment here, is very much based on that model, that same model. In some part, it is going to be backed by available data, but it's also going to be part of the community perspective, and what the community raises as concerns or potential concerns.
Yeah, because that part of that ties into David's earlier comment here about education, and if it's whatever can be done to inform or enlighten the general public, or maybe I should say lay people who aren't always around here like some of us are, as to that every ache and pain isn't necessarily a sign of cancer, and it doesn't necessarily mean that shop or that business or even that pickup truck or whatever it is going down the street is the cause of that. So that anything that can be done to balance this out so that the public goes away informed at the end of a workshop or a town hall meeting or whatever it is, is really informed. And maybe working with the medical community, with community hospitals or something like that, it would be a good idea. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, just to repeat the last part, working with the medical community, again, a very good suggestion. I would mention that one of our community partners for the PM and black carbon measurements project is actually the Long Beach Alliance for Children with Asthma, which is actually part of they are part of a larger organization, which is the hospital in that area, and so they can also always tap into a lot of that expertise from those experts there. In addition, I've actually been reaching out to other contacts that I have in the public health agencies, as well as cancer registry agencies, because we do get a lot of questions and concerns about cancer, and talking about how we can better collaborate and do outreach using the data that they have that we don't have access to.
Because I think a lot of people here know that I'm a cancer survivor, and it has nothing at all to do with air quality or anything like this, but it is a scary subject for people, and I think you're never quite prepared for that conversation with the physician. As I say, anything that can really inform the public as to what this is all about would be beneficial to everybody.
Sure. All right. Very good. Thank you for the great presentation.
Thank you.
We'll go ahead and move on to the next item number 5, the fiscal year 2018-19 general fund budget and fee adjustment.
Good afternoon, Chairman Benoit, members of the committee. Sujata Jain, Assistant DE of Finance. This is a presentation on our fiscal year 18-19 budget and fee increases. So in this presentation, I'm going to just give a summary of the fiscal year 18-19 budget, the actions that we took to balance the budget, and then amendments to Reg 3 fees. So here is a summary of the 18-19 budget and a comparison of that with the 17-18 budget. And the main thing to note is that the 18-19 budget is a balanced budget. This was very important to the board, and I'll show in my next slide how we balance the budget. And the fiscal year 17-18 budget was a deficit budget, and on the revenue side and the expenditure side, it's different, and it's increased by $15 million and $13 million on the expenditure side. So the main increases are due to the second year of Title V and non-Title V fees. Also, we have grants such as AB 617 in the revenue, and of course CPI. And on the expenditure side, we have increased retirement cost. We have the first year of our labor negotiation salary increases, and also expenditures because of increased FTEs. The 17-18 budget had 825 FTEs, and 18-19 budget has 876.4 FTEs. So here's how we balance the budget. It was a proposed $3.6 million deficit budget, but the board wanted us to balance it. So we have in our budget 8% vacancy rate that we assume. However, we increased it by 1%, and the 18-19 budget is at 9%. And even that's reasonable because generally our vacancy rate runs 10 to 11%. And we were only doing it for 1 year. And the reason why it runs higher is because we have almost 35 to 40 people. It's an aging workforce, and they do retire every year. So no matter how fast we try to recruit, and we are very diligent about recruiting, we do exceed the vacancy rate, and that's why we'll have some salary savings, and it'll be about $1.4 million. And then we also cut back our capital outlays and our services and supplies budget by $1.1 million each. So these capital outlays and services and supplies, we were asked to come back mid-year to ask for additional appropriations if our revenues came aligned, and also if our reserves looked okay. So we plan to go back because these are essential services and supplies and capital outlays, especially in the light of increased monitoring activity and outreach. This slide is just to show the impact of inflation on our 18-19 budget when you compare it to a 91-92 budget. The 91-92 budget was a $113 million budget, and now it's a $162.6 million budget. So of course it has increased by 47%. We had 1,200 FTEs in 91-92, and we have 876.4 FTEs in 18-19. However, when you factor in inflation, it is down by 13%. But another interesting point is that in this 18-19 budget, we have positions which are purely funded by grants. And if you really take that out, which weren't really there in 91-92, then our budget is going to be down by almost 20%. So the point is that we try to operate very efficiently over here, and we do that by using as many efficiencies as we can with technology. This pie chart is showing that it's a breakdown of our expenditures by work program categories, and almost 65 to 70% of our budget, general fund budget, is used for, is expended on core activities such as permitting, compliance, rulemaking, monitoring, advanced technology, and programs. And lastly, here are the main amendments to Regulation 3 fees that impact our budget. We increased fees by 3.4%, which is the CPI, and we are allowed to do that pursuant to Reg 320. And also, this is the second year of our Title V and non-Title V fees that the board approved last June 2017. And so the Title V fees are going to increase by 10.67% and non-Title V fees by 4%. And so with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions. Yes. Yes.
Sujata, in your humble opinion, another forward-looking question, what does a grant scenario look like for AQMD the next funding cycle from the feds?
From federal?
Yeah,
Um,
or even state?
So state, the main grants that are coming into the general fund is the AB 617, and we think that's going to be ongoing. And on the federal side, it seems pretty, stable. We generally get $7 million in the general fund, and so we think we'll get that again in the coming years.
Yes. I know this is premature, but as a member of the Budget Advisory Committee, I would, and also permit streamlining, I've been really impressed with what I've seen with Lockie and Ron's work on doing this. We've provided all of the industry trial partners for this, dry cleaners, auto body shops, and most recently gasoline dispensing stations, and to see the changes even from model to model. But I would think that maybe not next year's budget, but maybe the one after that, permit costs should really go down when you can do everything or practically everything online, from application to issuance of permits. And that's assuming, of course, everything is in order by the applicant. But I would hope that that large piece of your budget pie would be influenced by this technology innovation here in the next couple of years.
Yes, Bill, we agree. I mean, it's similar to what we did with our online payments. We had to initially invest money to get that program or software or implemented, and now we are seeing that a lot more people do pay us, with online. They pay us our fees online. So yes, we bring in efficiencies and we look at those things so that we can, bring those efficiencies in the various areas.
All right, very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We're going to our next item, the commercial fuel cell and battery electric vehicle update. Lisa?
Okay, good afternoon. I'm basically going to provide a slightly updated version of a presentation I gave to our Clean Fuels and Technology Advancement Advisory Group. Sorry about that. That's better. Okay. So I'll be giving an updated presentation that we gave to our Clean Fuels Advisory Group earlier this year. And the good news is that the market share for plug-in vehicles is increasing over time. California makes up about 49% of the national sales. And so even though the actual number of vehicles on the road is a small number, the good news is that number is increasing. And around the U.S., it's not just California, and it's not just the states that have adopted some of the ZEV regulations, but you are seeing increases throughout the country, but more heavily in these areas that are shown here on the map. And so one thing that's contrary to this, so we're trying to increase the turnover of all of the vehicles in California to cleaner vehicles. But as you see over time, the average age of the vehicles in California has been increasing, and in the U.S. in general. So part of this was due to the economy. Part of it, though, is to the vehicles are lasting longer. But it's really important that every vehicle that we get into our fleet is a cleaner vehicle. And so over the years, AQMD has been investing in advanced technology, cleaner fuels, and vehicles, and we'll continue to do that with a portfolio of technologies. So basically, this is a separate fund, not part of the budget that Sujata just covered, and it's actually got its own legislation. Yes?
Lisa, let me ask you a question from an old mechanic like me, okay? And it might not be your expertise, but let's say the traditional battery business, okay? Because I just put in an Everlast about even a year ago.
Right.
Whole different battery, running fine, all that good stuff. Does the fuel cell battery industry, and let's parallel it with the traditional battery industry, okay? Doesn't it make the traditional battery industry more efficient and leaner and actually better because of the competition, in your opinion?
That is an opinion that the competition does drive further innovation. Yes, that's a general trend that we see. And for example, in the starter battery in your vehicle is probably still a lead acid battery, but as you'll see later, the prices of lithium batteries are dropping, and over time that may even bring an advantage to starting batteries and vehicles that are not purely electric.
No, and even those discount jobs, where, $50 for a 1-year guarantee, the old, they're still around, obviously, but they're less and less and less now, and you don't see, most of the batteries are junk now. They don't recharge them anymore like they used to. So you can see the difference if you see that a lot.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of changes over the course of our Clean Fuels program, and I'll point out a few of the projects too later on where we're trying to make an impact. And so I'll be focusing mostly on light-duty vehicles. Yes, Rita?
Yes, before you move away from the previous slide, the third bullet down, the stationary source fee, can you elaborate on that fee is all about?
It's a very small part, but for those fees, we do try to support stationary fuel projects as well. So probably not ones that I would be actively supervising, but there would be staff that do that periodically. So I'm trying to think of some of the recent. Naveen might have more answers.
Good afternoon. This is Naveen Berry, and some of those funds are used for distributed generation and powering or energy efficiency type projects for stationary sources.
Where's the revenue coming from? Like, who's paying the fee? I guess that's my question.
Oh, I think it's a very small part of the annual emissions reporting fee.
Let's say that a battery costs $100 to make for round numbers. Okay, what fee would be extracted from that of that $100? 1%, 2%? Just ballpark it.
So the fee that we're talking about here,
right?
Most of the funding for the Clean Fuels program comes from a $1 registration fee that's paid by all of our car owners. So that's the bulk of the funding. The other $400,000 comes from a very small amount from our annual emissions reporting fee that most of the facilities complete.
Okay, and a small part of those clean fuel funds every year are used for us to add to our demonstration vehicles in our fleet. So most of these vehicles are leased so that we can continue to have newer vehicles in our fleet, but it's a mix of plug-in hybrid, battery electric, and fuel cell vehicles. So the mix of vehicles changes over time as we see new technologies that we want to demonstrate. And so AQMD uses these demonstration vehicles for education and outreach events. We often work with public affairs to try and find the right vehicle to display at an event, fill gaps. If there's a technology that we want to highlight that may not be a part of that event, then we can kind of add value to those events. And so this basically just shows a snapshot of what we have in our fleet currently. Just to show you kind of what's coming, some options for what's coming next. Over time, we expect to be adding more zero-emission vehicles that are battery electric or fuel cell, but there also are places in our fleet for additional plug-in hybrid vehicles. For example, maybe we don't have any small, passenger van or SUVs like that. So that might be a good application. And just some of the, I guess one of the new vehicles that's coming out, the Mercedes GLC F-Cell actually would be a plug-in fuel cell. So that's something that, a new technology that we have not seen yet in the light duty side. So the major automakers have invested many years of development in these vehicles, and many of these technologies can also be applied to heavy duty trucks and other vehicles. And so with additional development and focus on those applications specifically. So it's not just you drop in, it's not just a scaling of these technologies. You can't just double the battery size and just drop it in a truck and expect it to work. So a lot more development effort that also needs to go on for those vehicles as well. So to support these vehicles, both for the public and for our own fleet, AQMD has upgraded and added additional workplace charging. So we now have 92 level 2 chargers in our parking lot. And the installation was completed in March of 2017. Now, traditionally, we've provided this as a public benefit for people that plug in their vehicles here. But we started cost recovery last December. So we're now charging 6 cents per kilowatt hour for the first 5 hours and 16 cents per kilowatt after that. So the idea being that we want to encourage people to plug in when they come here, but we don't want them to park here for long term. So to try and get some of that turnover and efficient utilization of our charging infrastructure. You may have also noticed that we're starting construction of a faster charger, a DC fast charger. It's one of 18 sites that we were funded by the California Energy Commission to add to our area. And I also did just want to mention that AQMD with the MSRC is providing a residential charging incentive. So if you go out and get a plug-in vehicle, there'll be just a cord, a 120 volt cord that will come in the car. So you can literally take the vehicle and go home and charge it when you get home. However, for some of the vehicles with very large battery packs and longer range that are very attractive, that may take a very long time for you to recharge your car. And so this incentive will provide basically for a level 2, which is the faster charger, intermediate charge, like in our parking lot. And so that we can get up to $250 for a charger, the hardware, or up to $500 if you qualify as low income. And so also to support our fuel cell vehicles, we have a hydrogen station. This is actually the second hydrogen station that we've had, and it's based on delivered hydrogen. The hydrogen is generated by central natural gas reformation with 33% directed biogas, and that's delivered to us by Air Products. The hydrogen is further compressed and chilled to -40 when it reaches here to provide a faster fill, and it dispenses at both 70 megapascal and 35 megapascal pressure. So these are higher pressures than is typical for natural gas fueling, but it provides that equivalent gasoline range on your vehicles. So you can get more information about the stations at the California Fuel Cell Partnership website. There's a mobile web page where it actually tracks the availability of the stations. And there are 35 retail stations open in California now, plus 29 under construction, and funding under AB8 through the California Energy Commission to develop 100 hydrogen stations. There's also the governor's recent executive order is urging the addition of funding for additional hydrogen stations in the future. They're still in negotiations about the budget, so it's not finalized, but I think they're working on trailer bills, is my understanding. And so to help basically educate the public, get the word out, and support these newer vehicles, every year the California Air Resources Board has the authority, and they do the certifications of the light-duty vehicles. But we help highlight the cleanest vehicles by putting together a list. And we work with public affairs to do a publication, the carbine guide that's on the side table. So if you're interested, we basically would encourage you, if you can currently make some of your trips by walking or taking public transit, continue to do that. But next time you're in the market for a new vehicle, please check out the buying guide. And just to kind of briefly cover some of the federal and state incentives that are currently available. So the state has a clean vehicle rebate that's funded through cap and trade, and that's up to $7,000 for low income. But in our region, there's actually additional funding available through the Replace Your Ride program. So other incentives include access to carpool lanes with only the driver. And the state is doing a number of things to basically create action plans and working with other states to deploy these vehicles. The funding for the infrastructure is through the California Energy Commission, and local utilities are supporting with off-peak electric rates. And so just to show a little snapshot of the difference, from 2015, you started hearing some announcements of battery electric vehicles coming out. And then 2 years later, the announcements have proliferated. And keep in mind that for 2017, these announcements are not just all battery electric vehicles. They're usually a mix of plug-in hybrid and some fuel cell vehicles. But the announcements are proliferating worldwide. There's a lot of competition between automakers to bring out these new vehicles. And one of the things that's driving this is the cheaper battery prices. So the cost of lithium batteries has been dropping and is expected to continue to drop. And that is really helping to enable more vehicle models coming out. So just to give you a snapshot of a couple from General Motors, you can see the progress. As you look at the battery pack picture on the left, you can see the Chevy Volt battery pack that started in 2010. The second one from the left is the battery pack from the 2015 Chevy Volt. That's the plug-in hybrid. The third pack over is the Chevy Spark, which was their battery electric vehicle in 2010, which is no longer available. And the fourth battery pack is from the Chevy Bolt electric vehicle. So you can see there's a sophistication in the integration, and the battery packs now are starting to be standardized under the floor of the vehicle. So that was kind of a trend that really started with Tesla. And there was a lot of concern from the automakers, is that really the best place to put the vehicle? So after some additional work was done on the battery pack and additional crash testing, it seems to be the case. So now the cost of that Chevy Bolt electric pack is about $145 per kilowatt hour, and they're expecting price decreases. But GM is also working on fuel cell vehicles for different applications. And so Toyota also has plans for both battery electric, solid state batteries is one of the next technologies that automakers are looking at. And they're also continuing to develop fuel cell vehicles. So Toyota currently is the manufacturer that is producing the most fuel cell vehicles.
Lisa?
Yep.
Sorry.
Sorry.
I think we have a question here.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I understand that, Elon Musk is building this huge battery manufacturing facility in Nevada. And last week, China announced they're building a factory that's going to be 50 times larger, because they're going to be building 20 million electric-powered vehicles a year. There's now projected to be an incredible shortage of many of the battery building materials.
And that's one of the issues that I'm kind of highlighting here. This report from MIT was probably done last year, so it precedes that announcement. It is something to keep an eye on. But there's two sources of lithium. There's brine and there's metallic mining. And so it is an issue, but there are sources in the U.S., not just in China, for many of these resources. So it is going to become a worldwide supply chain. So this shows some of the early import and export uses for lithium. There are also other materials that they're keeping an eye on. But no, so far, it looks like a doable impact. So there's also other investments in mobility that are affecting which vehicles are getting the focus of automakers. So connecting vehicles to other transportation, automating many functions of the vehicle. And there will also be impact on local car dealers' businesses. So you can see a comparison between a typical Chevy vehicle maintenance over time and the amount of maintenance that is recommended for a battery electric vehicle. So all of these elements will be impacting the deployment of vehicles, the future costs, and the volumes of vehicles. So the cheaper batteries is being enabled by a reduction in cost. So if those reductions are not seen, then that could impact it. But basically, AQMD will continue to support development, research and development of vehicles, both on the hydrogen fuel cell side and on the battery electric side. So on the hydrogen side, we've been supporting the testing of these early stations. And we're also looking at ways to reuse some of the batteries. So we've been working with utilities and EPRI to demonstrate versatile auxiliary power. So emergency gensets that can be used. They can also be used to provide portable charging for electric vehicles. Or the box on the right could actually be mounted on utility trucks and run auxiliary power so that they don't have to run their engines while they're servicing their local utilities. So there's a lot more projects, but I think that'll give you just some of the highlights. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer those now or after the meeting.
Any other questions? All right, I think we're all questioned out. Okay. Thank you very much. Great update, and I'm especially excited to hear about the plug-in hydrogen fuel cell. That's something that after having driven both for a long time and now have three plug-in cars at home, that hydrogen car, when I drive it, seems like I'm constantly looking for hydrogen. So that makes it a little tough.
Yeah,
So.
yeah, definitely still working on that.
Yep. Thank you. All right. With that, I believe that's the end of our presentations, unless I'm missing something. We have our written report that's attached. Any other business or other items, board members? No? Okay. Public comment, anyone?